Hi everyone, welcome to this session where we will speak about interpretation of the Machinery Directive, and we're doing an interview with Ian Fraser. This is actually the first time that we organize such a session, and if you guys like it, please let us know, because then we're going to do more of these live broadcasts. Invite people, invite experts on the show for you to have an opportunity to ask questions. This is the session that is recorded on the 17th of April 2014. First off, let me introduce my co-host for today, Mr. Doug Nix. Doug is Managing Director at Compliance Insight Consulting Inc. in Kitchener, Ontario, in Canada, along with his partner Kimberly Nix. Doug is the he writes for the and it's I think you own it. You founded this blog, Machinery Safety One-on-One.
Yes.
He has more than 25 years of engineering technology experience, and with a focus on risk assessment and machine safety. Doug is also a member of the following professional organizations, including OSSAT. Do I say that correctly like that?
Yep, that's correct.
IEEE and the IEEE Product Safety Engineering Society, CSA and the SCC Canadian Advisory Committee to ISO Technical Committee 199. Welcome, Doug. Is there anything that I forgot to mention?
I don't think so, Han. Thank you very much, and I'm glad to be here this morning and to be able to participate in this hangout. It's great.
It's great to have you, Doug. And secondly, I would like to introduce the guest of our today's session, Mr. Ian Fraser. Ian is currently a self-employed consultant on topics like EU legislation, product safety, standardization, and market surveillance. He's working out of Brussels, Belgium, and until the beginning of this year, Ian was the European Commission's policy officer for the Machinery Directive, as well as the leader of the team that's dealing with machinery, cableways, lifts, ATEX, PP, and outdoor noise directive. Ian was with the Commission for more than 11 years, and before that, Ian was the policy officer in charge of regulations on design and use of PP and machinery in the French Ministry of Labour. Welcome, Ian.
Hello.
Did I forget to mention anything about your resume? There are any other things that you would like to mention?
No, but before working for the French Ministry and the Commission, I was also working for at least half of my life in industry.
That's good to note. You have an experience in machine engineering, mechanical engineering?
Well, actually, my basic qualification is occupational health and safety. I have a very general.
Sorry. Okay. And also with us today is Diana Scholtes. Diana is assisting me with producing this session, this show, and she'll be operating the chat box. Maybe later during the session we will bring her on and to see if there are any questions from your side. If you have seen, there is a chat box to the right side where you can post questions or leave your comments. There is also the possibility of sending questions or comments through Twitter. In that case, you just include at cemarking or hashtag cemarking, or one word, into the tweet, and Diana will pick it up and we can bring it into the show. If you are watching this on demand via YouTube or our website, we would really appreciate it if you would leave comments in the comment box below, or give us a thumbs up so we know that you appreciated this session. So first off, I would like to go into a little bit the big news story of the last few weeks, if you like. And a few weeks ago, the Commission has published amendments to 8 directives in what they called the alignment package. In this alignment package, there were amendments to 8 directives, and I will mention them for you: the EMC Directive, the Low Voltage Directive, the ATEX Directive, the Civil Explosives Directive, the Simple Pressure Vessels Directive, the Non-Automatic Weighing Instruments Directive, Measuring Instruments Directive, and the Lifts Directive. The new directives enter into force on the 19th of April of this year, so very soon, and the member states will have until 20th of April in 2016 to change their national legislation to transpose these new directives. And from that moment on, the old directives will also automatically be repealed. Now, Ian, the Machinery Directive is not a part of this particular alignment package.
That's correct.
Besides the Machinery Directive, you have at the Commission you have also dealt with the Lifts Directive and the Pressure Equipment Directive. Have you worked on these amendments?
Actually, the only one which was directly within my remit was the Lifts Directive. So I was, yes, closely involved in the proposal on the Lifts Directive, and also involved in the management, let's say, of the whole package.
And currently, or in this package, the Machinery Directive is not included, but will we see an amendment to the Machinery Directive soon?
Well, the main reason why the Machinery Directive was not included in this initial package of alignment with the so-called new legislative framework is that the Machinery Directive was completely revised not so long ago. The revision dates from 2006, but it's only been applicable from the beginning of 2010. So it was considered that it was too early to revise again the Machinery Directive, because we know perfectly well that industry needs a certain amount of legislative stability, regulatory stability. It's a big job taking on board new legislation, even when the changes are not necessarily substantial. Even just a change of number can affect the procedures in industry. That's the first reason. The second reason is that the Machinery Directive was revised at the same time as this new legislative framework was being developed. So the two processes went on in parallel, and to some extent the changes that were made to the Machinery Directive, some of them are broadly speaking in line with the MLF. For instance, the definitions of manufacturer, the definitions of Authorized Representative and so on are the same.
Okay.
Just to finish the answer, the machinery will be aligned.
Mm-hmm.
That will be done in the coming years. Probably a certain number of amendments to the Machinery Directive which have been identified as necessary will be grouped together in a single revision exercise in a few years' time.
Okay. But there are currently no dates set internally at the Commission.
Not as far as I know. As you know, I'm no longer working for the Commission, so
they don't share that information with you anymore.
But as far as I know, at the moment, what is being done is various questions are being studied, and studies could give rise to proposals to amend the directive, or not. That depends. And after those studies, there will be a clearer picture of what needs to be done. Then a proposal will be developed. There will be an impact assessment and so on. And it's certain that at that stage, the alignment with the new legislative framework will be part of the exercise.
Okay, Doug, have you had a chance to look through these amendments? And if so, what do you think is the significance of this package?
I've looked at the changes to low voltage and EMC primarily because they are the main directives which affect the work that I do with my clients. And from what I can see, it appears that they're primarily on the enforcement side. The technical requirements that are given in the essential health and safety requirements in the annex essentially is unchanged, which makes sense to me. That's what I would expect to see. That it's more about the regulatory mechanism that's attached to the directive as opposed to the actual technical requirements for the products.
Yeah.
I can confirm that was the purpose. Normally the technical requirements, the safety requirements are unchanged.
Okay. I suggest that unless any of you has some news to share with the audience, I propose that we go into the interviews section of this session, and that we go into the questions. Is that okay?
If I could pose a question, and we can handle this either now or later as you see fit, Han.
Okay.
But I would like to ask Ian about the integration of risk assessment into the low voltage and EMC directives, and whether he has any opinion about whether or not that's something that we're likely to see in the future.
That's a very good question. Let me think. Let's answer this question, and let's do it. Let's do it a little bit further down the session, if you agree, Doug.
Very good. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm taking a note of it. And actually, when you were asking the question, I was thinking also the General Product Safety Directive now incorporates principles of risk assessment. So it seems to be something that the Commission wants for all kinds of products. So I wanted to start off just by going a little bit in the past. Before coming to the situation now and going into the future. Ian, you came to the Commission in 2002, if I'm correct. You were probably involved in the Machinery Directive long before that, when you were working at the French Ministry, and maybe even already when working in industry. Can you tell us a bit about how the Machinery Directive evolved in the 10 years that you have been working with it in the European Commission, and what were the developments during your time?
Well, yes, the most important developments occurred before I came to the Commission. They occurred during the 90s, when progressively the scope of the directive was extended.
Mm-hmm.
So originally, the Machinery Directive dealt with mainly fixed industrial machinery and some, let's say, handheld or portable machinery. Then it was extended to deal with machinery for lifting operations and mobile machinery. And finally, it was extended to cover machinery for lifting persons. And so the scope of the directive has been was progressively broadened to cover pretty well everything that has a power source and that has moving parts, and with some exclusions, of course. But that occurred before I came to the Commission. When I came to the Commission in 2002, the Commission had already made its proposal for revision of the directive, and so I took part, representing the Commission, in the discussions in Council and Parliament on that proposal. And as you may remember, those discussions were extremely difficult. I think we must have beaten, unfortunately, a lot of records in terms of numbers of meetings of Council and Parliament to discuss that proposal.
Yes.
It was changed in many different ways. At one point, it almost got out of hand, and the manufacturers were calling for the withdrawal of the proposal. But I think we got there in the end. So in the end, in 2006, this revised directive was adopted. So that's the most important thing that happened while I was at the Commission. It wasn't a major change. I think the basic philosophy of the directive was kept. but nearly all its strong features were reinforced. So risk assessment, which was already an obligation in the directive, was made more explicit. The provisions for market surveillance were reinforced. The scope was clarified. Some of the essential health and safety requirements were made clearer or added for some new categories of machinery that came into the scope. So it was basically a consolidation exercise.
Mm-hmm.
Second thing, which is important for me, which I might mention, is that following the adoption of this revised directive, we made a new guide. There had already been guides to the original Machinery Directive, 2 editions, but we decided rather than simply to update the existing guides, we decided to write a new one.
Mm-hmm.
The objective was to consolidate a lot of knowledge and a lot of, let's say, work on interpretation and understanding of the directive, which had been done over the years, into a single document, which would really provide practical help to manufacturers trying to apply the directive, but also to authorities, all the other interested parties, notified bodies, all the other people involved in application of the directive. I'm particularly proud of that work because I did a lot of it myself. My name is on the cover, and I did a lot of the initial drafting and redrafting.
Yes.
The guide was discussed and agreed by the member states. That's very important because it means basically that it's a document which is a reference for all the member states. And that guide was published at the end of 2009, or let's say the complete version was published in 2010.
Mm-hmm.
It's proved very useful, I think.
Yeah.
I have to say it's an excellent piece of work. Very good.
I agree, Doc, and this is what I wanted to say. It's very helpful. It's very helpful when you're dealing with all kinds of questions. Maybe this you spoke already a little bit about risk assessment, Ian. Maybe this is a good time to go into that question that Doc asked about risk assessment and how, to what extent that is going to be further integrated into the low voltage directive and EMC directive, to your knowledge. And maybe, Doc, you would like to expand on that question a little bit.
Yeah, Han, I think the concern that I have as a practitioner working in this sector is that while it's been well integrated into the Machinery Directive and is now becoming an integral part of what machine builders do, when we look at the electrical safety side represented by the low voltage standards, and of course the low voltage directive now is really not directly applicable to most machines because it's addressed through Annex 1 of the Machinery Directive. There's not really any opportunity to use risk assessment as the basis for control measures that you might use. And I recognize that part of the issue is that the standards in this sector tend to be quite prescriptive in nature. But I also know that some of the standards are changing. There's work in IEC right now through IEC TC44 to integrate hazard-based safety engineering into at least one standard that I know of. And I'm wondering, if Ian has any thoughts on whether or not we're going to see an expansion of that approach in the low voltage sector.
Ian.
Yes, I think the difference between the low voltage directive and the machinery directive is mainly explained by their different history. The low voltage directive was much earlier. It's one of the first European harmonization measures in this kind of safety and technical area. And it's in fact a very succinct directive. The requirements set out in the directive are very short and concise. Why? Because basically it took on board an existing set of standards. Mm-hmm. European standards, many of them, most of them, the majority of them are standards, IEC standards developed by the International Electrotechnical Standardization Body. And so, for instance, I think it wasn't felt necessary to prescribe in the directive itself the obligation of manufacturers to carry out a risk assessment, because in the majority of cases, from the very start, applying the low voltage directive meant basically applying one of the existing harmonized standards. And I think low voltage electrical devices or equipment are covered by a very, very comprehensive body of harmonized standards. So the need for risk assessment, or let's say explicit risk assessment, was less acute. In the case of machinery, it was very different. When the Machinery Directive was adopted, basically there were hardly any harmonized standards, or international standards for that matter. There were some test standards and so on, but standards setting out how to design particular categories of machinery, they were developed after the Machinery Directive came into force. So it was obvious that in many cases, the machinery manufacturer had to carry out a design process without the help of standards or of let's say C-type standards for his particular category of machinery. So the need for an explicit risk assessment was more acute. But I think now most people recognize that risk assessment is a tool which has to be used in any product design where safety is the objective. And so more and more the directives will make explicit reference to risk assessment. And I think also we can say that in the field of machinery safety, there has been a lot of very, very useful pioneering work, particularly the development of specific standards for risk assessment. The standard for risk assessment of machinery has been a model for many other product areas, and even many other areas of activity outside the product manufacture. So that will certainly tend to generalize.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I can say too that I know that there's work done within ISO in developing ISO Guide 51, which is the consumer product safety guideline, and risk assessment is now part of that. And much of the material that's been integrated into Guide 51 actually came from ISO 12100, which of course is the general safety machinery standard. And I think. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Ian, but I believe that ISO 12100's origin was actually within CEN and was originally EN 292 and also EN 1050, which were then taken into ISO and developed into the current standards.
Yes, personally, I think for risk assessment, EN 1050 was what I refer to as a pioneering standard. That was really the first time, to my knowledge, that any coherent attempt has been made to set out in a step-by-step way how to carry out a risk assessment for a complex product like a machine. And because that was a very good standard from the beginning, it has provided. I would say many people, in fact, have taken over that method without even knowing where it comes from. It's now become part of engineering practice, I would say. And then, as you say, it was taken over, first of all, as an ISO standard in the ISO TC for machinery safety. Then it became, it was combined into the standard, the general methodological standards for machinery design, EN 12100. So that's where we are today. But as you say, when Guide 51, ISO IEC Guide 51 was revised recently, it was done in coordination with the machinery safety sector in ISO and IEC, and aligned as far as possible with the method set out in the machinery standard 12100.
Yeah. I have another question which is more related to certain responsibilities that are formulated in the Machinery Directive. In the last amendment to the Machinery Directive, the concept of person authorized to compile the technical documentation was introduced. Can you explain what the Commission's idea behind this person is, how it differs from the concept of authorized representative, and why was there not chosen for the option of obliging non-EU manufacturers to appoint an authorized representative to take care of this? And the question comes in particular because Decision 768 gave a very nice description of responsibilities of economic operators, but this person authorized to compile the technical file was not a part of that.
No, that's true. Well, I think for most of the EU product safety directives, we can say that having, for the manufacturer to have an authorized representative is a possibility, an option, but it's not mandatory. There are some exceptions. For instance, the medical devices directive, it's mandatory to have an authorized representative in the EU for producers outside the EU. But in general, it's not mandatory.
Mm-hmm.
That means that a manufacturer outside the EU can place a product on the market in the EU directly himself, and he can carry out all the obligations of the manufacturer. He doesn't have to mandate somebody else to carry out these obligations for him. But if it's more convenient, he can mandate an authorized representative.
Mm-hmm.
So when the Machinery Directive was revised, there was no intention to change this.
Mm-hmm.
It's a general principle, let's say. But the member states had noted problems, mainly in the framework of market surveillance, so the market surveillance authorities had met problems getting into contact with some manufacturers based outside the EU.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was why it was proposed. It wasn't proposed by the Commission, it was proposed by the Council, by the member states, to introduce an obligation for all manufacturers to include in their EC Declaration of Conformity the name and address of a person in the EU who they can contact if they need to obtain elements of the manufacturer's documentation.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So this person, the word compile can give rise to some misunderstandings. It's the manufacturer who draws up the documentation, who keeps it.
Mm-hmm.
He must provide the name and address of somebody in the EU who is able to act as a contact person so that the member states authorities can obtain the necessary elements of the documentation when they need it.
Okay.
So if the manufacturer has an authorized representative, I think it would be very likely, very logical for that authorized representative to also be the person, the contact person for the technical file.
Yes.
But if there is no authorized representative, there still must be somebody in the EU who can act as a contact person.
Okay. Do you know of any discussions within the Commission to introduce this concept to other directives as well?
Not as far as I know.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Let's say it resulted from specific experience in the machinery area. But I know, for instance, that the new market surveillance regulation makes it mandatory for manufacturers of medical devices to have an authorized representative in the EU. So there are differences between one product area and another.
Okay. Doug, do you have such a concept in legislation in the United States and Canada? That you know of?
No, and this is actually something that I think that European manufacturers probably find quite confusing, because as far as the approach for machinery safety is concerned, there is no explicit regulatory framework that requires any sort of a declaration or any third-party involvement with really any type of machinery. There are some exceptions. Pressure vessels typically are required to have an ASME stamp on the nameplate, showing that they've been manufactured by an ASME certified shop. And as far as electrical safety is concerned, there is a requirement that products placed on the market in Canada bear an electrical safety mark of some kind, and that could be a certification mark or a field evaluation. In the US, it's much more a Wild West sort of condition. Each state, and in some cases many of the cities, have their own electrical codes. And there's no explicit requirement that products bear a safety mark, with the exception of in the OSHA regulations. But again, in the U.S., not all the states have adopted OSHA, and so consequently, it's really a state-by-state and city-by-city situation where you actually have to get in contact with the authorities in that area, find out what the regulatory requirements are, and meet those. Now, if a manufacturer wants to take the safest approach, you go ahead and do the electrical safety marking of the product in any case. And if you have pressure vessels, you put marked vessels into the equipment. And beyond that, there's really nothing more to do to meet the regulatory requirement. The real catch at the end is that if there is an injury related to your product, in the U.S., the liability law situation is one that will result in probably the employer or the employer's insurer coming after the manufacturer of the machine and attempting to place some liability or all the liability on the manufacturer of the equipment. In Canada, our liability law is similar, but we're a much less litigious society, and so consequently the responsibility for worker safety is placed directly on the employer, and so that means that in many cases the manufacturer of a machine is excluded from that type of a lawsuit. So it's a little different environment in that way, but we have nothing similar to the Machinery Directive at all, and I really wish we did.
Right. That explanation, both on the situation in the US and in Canada, explains the extraordinary difficulty and complexity of the current transatlantic dialogue, or the attempt to reduce barriers to trade in
Yes.
the US and EU, because our systems are so based on such different principles.
Well, and if you look even at the Canadian situation, we have 10 provinces and 3 territories, and yet we have laws that are barriers to trade province to province, and we're within one country. If we can't solve those basic problems, how will we ever solve the problems with dealing transatlantically with Europe? It's a very difficult challenge.
And we have 28 member states, but they joined rather late. We formed the European Union rather later than Canada, so maybe we've managed to produce to create our internal market more successfully.
Well, having said that, Canada's only been a sovereign nation for 30 years, so
how is that?
we only patriated our constitution 30 years ago. So up until then, we were still a colony of the UK. So there you go.
Oh.
What you said about Canada is almost what the situation was in the EU before the Machinery Directive. In other words, before the Machinery Directive, responsibility for safety of machinery in the vast majority of the member states was the responsibility of the employer. And it's still the responsibility of the employer, but the employer can rely on supply of work equipment, particularly machinery, which complies with specific safety regulations. So there is a share of responsibility for overall machinery safety between employers and manufacturers, and also the manufacturer's liability is limited, because if he applies those regulations and he applies them correctly, normally he isn't liable to pay compensation or damages in case of an accident. That is the accident insurance system.
And those really are the missing pieces here. Those are the things that we need that we don't have. So yeah, good points, really good points.
Actually, this is an excellent segue into the next question. But I see in the chat box there was mentioning a question by Nathan. If you lodge a technical file with a notified body, as required by the ATEX directive, are you still required to provide a contact within the EU as per the Machinery Directive? Ian, Doug, I'll let you also go into that quickly. A technical file typically is not lodged with a notified body, correct?
Well, I'm not certain of that provision in the ATEX directive, but we certainly have no obligation to lodge the technical file of machinery with any third party. It's not obligatory for the manufacturer to have the technical file in a single box, if you like, or file. The notion of technical file or technical documentation are all the elements which are needed to prove how the manufacturer has complied with the directive.
Yeah.
Providing he can access these different elements, let's say in an IT system, quickly enough to be able to produce the evidence when it's required. There is no obligation to have a box with the technical file in it. So the notion of lodging the technical file doesn't really exist. The technical documentation is all the elements of the manufacturer's documentation which may be needed to prove that the product complies, or to show how it has been designed to comply with the essential requirements.
Right.
And I usually recommend to my clients that they don't create a paper document because it's much more difficult to maintain. In terms of lodging the technical file, typically the approach that I've been taking in my practice is to suggest that if the manufacturer has a business unit within the European Union, that they designate someone within that organization to be the authorized representative, and that person be given access, as Ian suggests, through an IT system to the file. And if they don't have that, then the alternatives are to either make an arrangement with a notified body, and most of the notified bodies will hold your file for you for a fee, or to work with an attorney also within the European Union and do the same thing. And whether those organizations have electronic access, or whether they want you to provide a CD, a DVD, a paper copy, that's entirely a commercial discussion between you and the body involved.
That's right. That's also how we do it. We provide such services, and we typically arrange that we will have access to a server where the documentation is stored. Moving on, if you allow me, we were having a discussion about the responsibilities, and the CE marking responsibility has to be fulfilled at the moment that the product is placed on the market. And typically that is one moment in time. Ian, can you explain what in the European Commission's view that means specifically for two situations I wanted to ask you? First of all, the situation that a directive is amended and relevant essential requirements are updated. And secondly, what that means when relevant European standards on the list of European harmonized standards are updated. Will the manufacturer, for example, need to apply the amended directive or the amended standards? Does he need to update his Declaration of Conformity and so forth?
Yes, you're right to say that the directives apply when the product is placed on the market in the EU. And I should just specify that means each individual product. So
okay,
it's not referring to a model. Sometimes we say a product, we are thinking of a model of product or type of product. Placing on the market occurs for each individual product. So
that means, sorry to interrupt you, so that means if you have a product that is produced in serial production, that means every time a batch, for example, a container enters into the EU market, that is the moment of placing in the market?
That's right, yes. So supposing you have a series which runs for 10 years, and in the middle of after 5 years the legislation changes, you can't just say, well, this is the same product. If there is a change that occurs during the production, then each individual product at the relevant date must comply. So you might have to change your design. It's just a detail, but the word product is sometimes ambiguous between a product type and an individual product. And placing on the market applies to individual products. Come back to the question. The answer when the legislation changes is quite simple. So if the legislation applies to let's say a series or batch of or series of batches of products, but there should be a link between. It should be possible to establish a link between the Declaration of Conformity and the product, any product you may find on the market. And so when we had this cut-off date, 29th of December, it meant that supposing the manufacturer had an order for a machine, he had to calculate really, was he going to actually place the product on the market before or after 29th of December 2009, and if it was before, he had to comply with the previous directive, and if it was after, he had to comply with the new directive.
And I think that same logic also applies with the technical standards. If you're in series production and the technical standards are revised, then by the time you get to the mandatory implementation date that's shown in the list of harmonized standards, you must be applying that standard. But if it's a single unit production situation for a custom machine, then it's the technical standards that are in force at the time when that particular product is placed on the market.
Well, that's where the situation, in my opinion, becomes more complex, because under the so-called new approach, now called the new legislative framework in the EU, the requirements, the so-called essential health and safety requirements set out in the directives are mandatory, but the harmonized standards are never mandatory.
Right.
And this is very important. Harmonized standards provide specifications which enable manufacturers to comply with the applicable essential health and safety requirements, particular categories of products. They are not mandatory, but when their references are published in the official journal in the list of harmonized standards, application of the standards confers what we call a presumption of conformity. Essential requirements covered by the standard. That means that if the manufacturer can show that he's applied the standard and that the standard covers the essential requirements of his product, he doesn't have to provide any further proof of conformity. That's sufficient proof. But as the standards are not obligatory, not mandatory, he can apply other technical specifications. He can say the solutions proposed by the standard that don't fit my case, or I invented some new means of designing the product, and he is free to do so. So the standards never become mandatory, even when their reference is listed in the official journal. But if he does apply other technical specifications, he must, in that case, demonstrate that the solutions he has adopted comply with the essential requirements. You can't just make a reference to a standard. So supposing, I don't know, a US manufacturer decides to apply a US standard or an ISO standard, which is not a harmonized European standard for particular aspects of the design, he is free to do so, but in his technical file he must show how application of this ISO standard or US standard or other specification enables the product to comply with the essential requirements. So that means that the presumption of conformity, of course, ceases to exist when the standard is withdrawn. So when a standard is replaced by a revised standard, this happens very frequently. There is usually a date on which the superseded version, the previous version of the standard, has to be withdrawn. And from that date, it no longer confers presumption of conformity. But the question is, does that mean that the manufacturer at that time, at that date, is forced to withdraw the product or redesign the product that has been designed according to the previous version of the standard? The answer is not necessarily. It all depends on what the changes are in the standard. So to cut a long story short, I would say if the new standard really represents a new level of safety, then in that case, the product designed according to the previous version can no longer be considered to comply with the directive. The directive requires you to take account of what we call the state of the art, the level of safety which can be achieved at a given time. But many revisions of standards, in fact, don't really represent a new level of safety. They improve the standard, maybe improve the drafting, improve the clarity, improve the test methods, but they don't really, they are not really a new level of safety. And in that case, I don't think a manufacturer can be obliged, or is not obliged to necessarily withdraw products designed according to the previous version of the standard. What we can say he must do, he must monitor the development of the relevant standards, the standards that apply to his products, and when a standard is revised, the manufacturer must check whether or not the changes are such as to require upgrading of the products or not.
Yes.
That is an obligation which is now explicitly in the Machinery Directive, because we say that it's stated in the directive that the manufacturer must keep himself aware of developments in the state of the art. And it's something which is always easy to understand outside the EU, because in many parts of the world, standards are basically considered mandatory. The EU system, at least for the new approach directives, the NLF, the standards are never mandatory.
Thank you.
They're very
thank you, Ian.
not mandatory.
Let's, if you will, there are two questions that were sent in prior to this session. We are now almost 1 hour on our way. Maybe briefly, or it's 3 questions actually. Let's try to answer those questions if you like.
Okay.
I had a question from Mr. Leo Eisner. How will the new medical device regulation that is in the process of being developed connect or coordinate with the Machinery Directive? Will there be a connection between the two, or will they be totally separate, as the Machinery Directive is a directive and the new medical device requirements will become a regulation? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I think I can be quite brief on this. The fact that it's a regulation rather than a directive doesn't change anything from that point of view. That is mainly concerned with the internal legal system of the EU, because a directive has to be transposed in the legal system of all the member states, whereas a regulation doesn't need to be transposed. It's applicable directly, but it doesn't really change the content, the obligations. But yeah, there is. I can't foresee what will come out of the discussions in Parliament and Council on the medical devices regulation, because at the moment it's a proposal from the Commission. No, the Commission proposes, but the legislator in Europe, the legislators are the Council and Parliament, so they can change the Commission's proposal. But so I'm basing my reply on the Commission's proposal. Current situation with the Medical Devices Directive and the Machinery Directive is that for a medical device, only the Medical Devices Directive is applicable. By both directives, but the Medical Devices Directive contains a provision which says that if any requirements of the Machinery Directive are needed to do with risks that are not in the Medical Devices Directive, then the medical device manufacturer has to apply those requirements. So if you like, the device, the way it's done, you take the necessary requirements from the Machinery Directive. They are in the Medical Devices Directive, but then you only need to apply one directive.
Okay.
And the change is that the Commission's proposal for a medical devices regulation, which will replace the current Medical Devices Directive, in the Commission's proposal, that will change.
Okay.
Instead of including the requirements of the Machinery Directive in the Medical Devices Directive, the situation will be that if a product is in the scope of both directives, in other words, if it corresponds to the definition of machinery and it also corresponds to the definition of medical device, which is the case for some products, then the Medical Devices Directive obviously applies because that contains a lot of more specific requirements for medical devices. But if there are any requirements that are not covered by the Medical Devices Directive, then the manufacturer will have to apply the Machinery Directive as well. So he will have to apply, in fact, both directives.
Mm-hmm.
So if that is accepted by Council and Parliament, that will be a change.
Mm-hmm.
I think if I could offer an example here, a machine that might fall in this category would be, say, a surgical robot, where obviously the medical device applications are significant, but also there are significant machinery-related hazards and so on that would need to be dealt with using provisions of the Machinery Directive and the related standards. Is that a reasonable statement, Ian?
That's correct. There are quite a few medical devices which are also machines. Even a powered hospital bed, for instance, which is very common now, is a machine and it's also a medical device. So
right.
This was discussed some years ago when the current Medical Devices Directive was last revised, and at that time I was involved. I proposed this solution. I said, to avoid having to apply both directives to the same product, why not have an article which includes the necessary requirements of the Machinery Directive in the Medical Devices Directive, in the same way as we do for the requirements of the Low Voltage Directive and the Machinery Directive. So that was a technique, but it appears that the Commission has decided to adopt another solution in the new proposal.
Okay.
Well, and I think from the point of view of manufacturers, that's actually a considerable relief, because it allows them to focus on the key directive for their product and only draw in the pieces that they need from the other standards or the other requirements from other directives. So I think that's been a very good move.
I have another question here from Mr. Francesc Daura Luna. Taking into account the next safety directive for machinery, or the next update, let's say, the amendments that will be coming to the Machinery Directive, is this new directive going to reinforce the electromagnetic compatibility aspects in the functional safety? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I should say there is no plan yet for a revision of the Machinery Directive, so we don't know what the next revision will include.
Uh-huh.
But as far as I know, that subject is not under discussion at all. The situation with respect to electromagnetic compatibility, we have a very broad directive, the Electromagnetic Compatibility Directive, which deals with the problem of any product, all products, let's say, with a few exceptions, but pretty well all products which are susceptible, which may generate electromagnetic disturbance. Otherwise, in modern life, nothing would work because every device would be perturbed or disturbed by every other device, and nothing would work. So a very important directive, but it's not a safety directive. It doesn't. The electromagnetic compatibility requirements are not safety requirements. The Machinery Directive has a safety requirement relating to external radiation, including electromagnetic radiation. So a machine must, the functioning of a machine must not be disturbed by external radiation. And that is a safety requirement, because if it was the case, you could have unintended startup or unintended stop or unintended change of speed or whatever of a machine because something else was operating in the vicinity, and that would be a safety problem. So the safety requirements relating to electromagnetic radiation are in the Machinery Directive. And that corresponds to part of the EMC Directive. In fact, it's what is called immunity. In other words, machinery must have sufficient immunity to electromagnetic disturbance so that it doesn't create an unsafe situation. But the other side of electromagnetic compatibility relating to emissions, not covered by the Machinery Directive. So in that case, the EMC Directive applies. So the requirements that a machine shall not emit electromagnetic radiation which is liable to disturb the functioning of other devices, that is covered by the EMC Directive. As far as I know, this distinction doesn't create any problems, and I don't expect that it will be changed the next time the Machinery Directive is revised.
All right.
Actually, if I could speak to that a little bit, I know that the IET in the UK has been doing some considerable work in relation to EMC and functional safety. And one of my colleagues, Keith Armstrong, has been instrumental in developing a guide that's available from the IET for free that deals with that specific topic. And in a recent presentation that I saw him give at one of the IEEE conferences, he was mentioning that one of the challenges is that the current EMC standards that are typically used under the EMC directive actually are not sufficient to really determine whether or not there's a functional safety impact from emissions or immunity related states, and so one of the things that's being worked on with some considerable focus is the development of EMC test standards that will guide manufacturers in dealing with the safety related aspects of immunity to electromagnetic phenomena in the environment where the equipment operates. This is a really big challenge because the typical test methods are just not adequate to deal with this.
Yeah, I understand. It's true that the more kind of wireless devices, devices incorporating radio emitters and so on, there are in the environment, and as far as I can see at the moment, there are more and more. The more there is a risk, particularly that the electronic control system of the machine could be affected. That's not acceptable. So, but the only thing I was saying was that okay, there may be a need for new standards or new test methods, but the essential requirement, which is just one sentence, which says that I can even read it to you. It's in the Machinery Directive. It's essential requirement 1511. Machinery must be designed and constructed in such a way that external radiation does not interfere with its operation. That's, in terms of legal requirements, that's all you need. Then maybe you need new standards and new test methods to achieve that.
We're over 1 hour now, but I received this question from Mr. Tony Rose that I would like to use and to end today's session. So this question from, as I said, Mr. Tony Rose. He has been involved in Machinery Directive ever since 1988, even prior to it being introduced. He writes the following: I find in the UK that there are consultants who specialize in advising companies about these subjects, who do not have the experience and potentially jeopardize companies into falling foul of the regulations. He asked the question, isn't it about time some form of legal qualification was introduced to ensure that people working within this field are more regulated? At the moment, there are no restrictions to prevent anyone from compiling documentation. And companies know that they should be doing what they should be doing to complete technical files, but choose to ignore the requirements of maintaining files. For example, test certificates have a tendency to get lost, design updates are ignored, and so on. Ian, in your opinion, should there be more regulations for consultants in this field?
Well, I've just become one, so...
So clearly not. That's, you don't need anything more there. Yeah.
And nobody asked me for my consultant certificate.
But Doug, maybe I can ask you, because I would say in North America, in Canada, in the United States, you have more, I would say, more professional societies. And maybe you can tell a little bit about how that works and how certification of persons is done there.
Okay. Well, I mentioned earlier that I'm a member of IEEE, which started out as a U.S.-based organization, but in fact is international now.
Mm.
We have about 430,000 members globally. Admittedly, the bulk of them are still in North America, but there are chapters and members in virtually every country around the world. IEEE does not offer a personnel certification process. In fact, even though it's a professional engineering society, really anyone who has interest and is willing to pay the dues is capable of becoming a member. The focus for IEEE is on developing technology for the advancement of humanity overall. So the clear focus within that is to bring any practitioner in who has something that they feel that they can contribute to the work. Having said that, under ISO there is a standard called ISO 17020, which is intended specifically for the certification of personnel, and that is a standard which people can gain accreditation under. To my knowledge, there is no legal requirement in any jurisdiction in the world that requires someone to have 17020 accreditation. But where we have seen this starting to occur more is in the functional safety area, where organizations like TUV Rhineland, TUV Sud, Exida, and some others are offering certified functional safety engineer and certified functional safety expert certifications. And some of those organizations do that work under 17020, and some do not. So really, if you want a valid accreditation as a practitioner, one of the important questions to ask is the certificate that I'll be granted at the end of whatever program I'm going to undertake, is that certificate based in 17020? And that requires that the person's credentials and expertise and so on is evaluated by an accredited organization. So in Canada, that would be Standards Council of Canada. There are different organizations in different countries. There's also an organization called INARTE. It's INARTE, and they have been offering EMC and electrical safety test accreditations for practitioners for many years. And the IEEE Product Safety Engineering Society has been associated with that effort. We've been providing test questions and expertise in developing the accreditation requirements for INARTE for many years. So that's another route that you can go to. But outside of that, there is no explicit requirement that I know of in any jurisdiction for the accreditation of a machinery safety specialist. There's lots of voluntary things that you can do, but there's no legal requirement anywhere.
Okay, thank you very much.
I have the feeling, if I can butt in,
sure.
that to be a valid expert on not just machinery safety, but applying the EU machinery safety legislation, you have to be what the French call a sheep with 5 legs. Not enough to be a mechanical engineer or an electrical engineer or a chemical engineer or a lawyer or an occupational health and safety. You have to be all those. You have to be able to all those. So it's not easy for a certifier to say, well, what is needed? What are the qualifications which are needed? And I know a lot of people, and I've met a lot of people during my different jobs in this area, who are able to give manufacturers very, very good, sound, and practical advice, usually on the basis of long experience. So I would really, I don't expect that you will get national or European regulations in this area. There may be scope for voluntary certification, but otherwise I think it's for manufacturers to find the good advice, and in the same way as if you hire a lawyer, you can find a good lawyer and a bad lawyer. I think if you're looking for a consultant or an expert on machinery safety legislation, there are good and bad, and you you have to make a judgment yourself.
Yes, I agree.
There is a sort of related situation in the province of Ontario, where we have a requirement for what's called a pre-start health and safety review, and it's the only province in Canada that has this requirement is Ontario. And the Professional Engineers Ontario basically gives the following guidance to their licensees, and that is to not practice outside your area of expertise. And that is the beginning and the end of the guidance that's given to professional engineers that wish to provide machinery safety evaluations. Personally, I think that that is a problem, because what I've seen in my practice is that if you get 3 different engineers and you have them all look at the same machine, you get 3 completely different evaluations of the same piece of equipment. It's a bit like having the three blind mice looking at an elephant and trying to determine what it is. And I think the other issue is that you also get, as Mr. Rose mentioned in his question, you often get new graduates or people that don't have adequate expertise but think they do getting involved. And you also always get some people that are unscrupulous and are prepared to sell their signature for a few $100s. Yeah. And all of those become a problem for the end user, because from a legal standpoint in Ontario, it's the employer who has the responsibility to determine whether the person they hire has the adequate qualifications to do the work. Yes. So if they turn out to be incompetent, then it lays upon the employer even more firmly than it would if they hadn't done the work at all.
All right. Thanks for your answers. I have one quick question that popped up in the chat box that I can answer very quickly from Mr. Phil Newman. Mr. Newman has a company with a regional office in France. Under the directive, can our office hold the technical file for our products? The answer is yes, it can. So I would like to. We're well past the hour, and I think that we have to stop here. I would like to thank both of you, Ian and Doug, for making yourself available. You both have busy schedules for talking to our audience, with our audience, for 1 hour answering questions. Maybe if people have questions and would like to contact you, Ian, where would you like us to send them to?
You can send them to my email address.
Which is, maybe you can mention?
Ian Fraser without a dot, IANFRASER dot safety at gmail.com.
And Doug, if people would like to get in contact with you, where would you like us to send them to?
By email, you can reach me at dnix@complianceinsight, that's all one word, .ca. Or alternatively, you can go to our corporate website, which is complianceinsight.ca, or to our blog, machinerysafety101.com, and you can reach me by email through any of those channels.
And Diana has put the email address of Ian in the and of Doug in the chat box, so you'll find him there as well. If you would like to contact me, you can do so at han@cemarking.net. That's HANN, like in New York, at cemarking.net. Or you can follow us on Twitter with our Twitter handle, cemarking.net. You can find us on LinkedIn, everywhere. So thank you very much, everyone. I believe from looking at the response today, the questions that we received, this is something that we may want to do more often. Ian, could we invite you maybe back in a few weeks? Would you be willing to come back on the show?
Why not?
Why not? Okay. And Doug, yeah, we already discussed this. I think there is a need for providing more information on machine safety and machine compliance. So maybe we can do this another time.
I definitely agree. I'm ready and willing and able whenever you are.
Well, and what people may not know is that you used to run a podcast on machine safety and on machine compliance. What happened to that podcast?
Mostly time. It was taking me a considerable amount of time to do the production work, and I began to get busy enough in the rest of my practice that I simply needed the time to look after my customers instead of producing the podcast. So I may get back to that at some time. I've had a number of people ask me to do that, but it may be on a less frequent schedule than I originally envisioned.
Oh. And if we can help you by doing it in this format and helping you to produce the show, that would be great. I think we should do it. So I would like to thank everybody for watching, for taking the time to be with us live. If you are watching this on YouTube, that is great. I would like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. This means that you will get an automatic notification whenever we post videos there. But it is also for us to see that there is appreciation for the videos that we put out there. You can also use the comment boxes there at YouTube or on our website to post more questions, post comments, and give us feedback. That would be great. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Han.
Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.